Welcome to the Unlist. You can probably hear a bunch of fans in the background, and there's not much I can do about that, unfortunately. There's some abatement going on in this area where I'm shooting the video. Those of you who don't know what abatement is, you can look it up. It's basically removal of moisture from an area. So it is what it is. Closed captioning, if that works, you can turn off the sound and just read the words at the bottom of the screen, but can't be helped. Now, the topic of the video can be pretty controversial for some people. I have seen folks get really virulent and angry and antagonistic over this particular topic. So I've waited this long to do a proper video on this subject. I have done live streams in the past, and I've made enemies. I open my mouth, truth comes out, enemies are made every time. And it's a bit of a segue. It's not really exactly what this video is about, but you guys know with any hobby community, you get some very, very passionate fringe members of that community, what I like to call the vocal minority, right? And in this case, where reformulations are concerned, you do have a very vocal minority that feels like only the oldest possible version of anything is the correct version to have. That if you don't have the bottles literally sold on day one the fragrance was released, if you have even day two, so if it came out on a Monday and you bought your bottle on a Tuesday, you have a false version of that bottle. You have a shadow of its former self. You have a pretender. You have a usurper. You are a heretic. You are a blasphemer. Burn them, they're a witch at the stake. Drown them. If they survive, they're a witch. Burn them anyway. Okay? That is the level of craziness some people have where reformulations and such are concerned. They build churches, okay? They're like televangelists from the 1980s, like Jerry Falwell or Jimmy Swaggart, whoever. They get up on there and they're like, hallelujah, da 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 da, Church of Oak Moss, da 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 da. And, you know, they're on the floor writhing, speaking in tongues or whatever, dancing with snakes. I don't know, guys. I try to keep it level. And thus, this video, like it or not, is going to be very, very level about reformulations. I mean, you can tell by the title, okay? Reformulations, the good, the bad, the ugly. That means all three exist. Those of you who feel like there's only an ugly, yeah, you're not going to like this video, because there is good. There is some good. Maybe less good than there is bad. Clearly, reformulations seldom improve a fragrance. But, you know, it's not a black or white thing. There are very many shades of gray in between, clearly. And if you are one of those people that only sees in black and white, you are probably a Sith Lord. And if you're a Sith Lord, then I'm pretty sure there are some Jedi after you right now, so you might want to run, okay? Because only the Sith deal in absolutes, and I am not one. Now, the thing about reformulations, too, is that not a lot of people in the YouTube space are willing to speak truthfully on them. And the reason is, controversy gets clicks. Hype gets clicks. Platitudes, sweeping, blanket statements, all of those things psych people up and they get clicks. I've already done videos on influencers versus tastemakers. I've done those videos. I've talked about the carnival barkers. I've talked about the P.T. Barnum types, okay? I've talked about the snake oil salesman. That stuff's already been covered. So you should already know by now that there be sharks in them waters, okay? And most of those sharks are not going to tell you the truth about reformulations. They're going to tell you what they think you want to hear. They're going to give you the confirmation bias because they want you to subscribe. Okay? They want that passive income from your subscription. They want you to donate to them in live streams. They want you to buy their merch through their endorsement links or whatever. So them telling you a very level, middle of the road truth about reformulations doesn't get that frenzy, doesn't get the zeitgeist, and thus they can't profit from it. Me, I don't care. Clearly, look at where I film, look at my total lack of production values that I have for every single video. No editing, no fancy cutting, no filters. You know, it's just 18 to 25 minutes of me talking and that's it, take it or leave it. So I have no reason to lie to you. Okay, now, bottom line here about reformulations, the good, the bad, the ugly, is that reformulations are almost always compulsory. almost always. Which means the houses that make the fragrance are required to reformulate. It's seldom a choice, okay? And usually the requirement comes either from upstairs, you know, shareholders, big business folks, accountants saying we need cheaper formula because the sales aren't as good, so we can't make up volume, so we're going to make up margin, so we need to lower the cost going out the door so they can recoup more money per bottle sold or whatever. Or maybe it's the marketing eggheads, you know, the people who do the mood boards, right? The consumer testing folks, the focus groups, and they're saying, well, we think if you do this to the fragrance formula, you tweak it this way, it'll sell more. So then, of course, the perfumers or whoever is involved are like, well, okay, I guess we got to do this now, right? It's compulsory. And then there's also regulation, right? Regulation is a thing. This material is no longer usable. This material can only be used this much, and you have this much in your fragrance. So you need to reformulate your fragrance so that it can have this much. Okay. And then there are materials shortages, material discontinuations, where the material is no longer being made anymore. The oil house or the chem firm that supplied this particular compound went out of business or discontinued producing this particular material, or it's a natural. And you know how supply goes with naturals. You know, naturals are coming from Mother Earth, and we're killing the planet. So our supply of naturals is just going away and getting more and more expensive every year. You know, pretty soon you're not going to see fragrances that have any naturals at all on the shelves, because having them will be a total luxury, which is an angle that brands like Rajadov and such can bank on in the future. All our fragrances have naturals because we can afford to spend money on them. That's actually kind of already happening with some houses, honestly, it is. But point is, these are all compulsory things. This is not the perfumer or the designer themselves, you know, if the designer is still alive. Christian Dior, Gabrielle Chanel, they've been gone for a long time. But whoever the creative director is, so Alessandra Michele, who used to be the creative director for Gucci, right? Alessandro is not sitting there going, hey, I should go and tweak this Gucci fragrance, right? I think it needs to smell this sort of way. It's not the case. It's always compulsory. It's always coming from upstairs. Whether it's a regulatory body or capitalist corporate ghouls, you know, accountants, focus groups, somewhere in that space, it's coming downhill. It's coming downhill to the house, and then they've got to make changes to satisfy the requirements, the regulations, or to satisfy the profit projections of whoever's, you know, counting the dollars, paying the bills. And that sucks. That really sucks, man. It's never, ever, ever a creative endeavor. Reformulation is almost never a creative endeavor. Almost never. And in the few times where it is, because there are exceptions to every rule, that's why I said almost. When reformulations are a creative endeavor, it's usually not on a lark, hey, let's just make this fragrance better. That's not it. It's usually a corrective measure. When it is a creative endeavor, it's because they're trying to fix a screw up, you know? And this is where we do see improvements in fragrances. Very seldom, but we do see improvements. And they usually boil down to previous reformulation was terrible and it lost sales. So we got to fix it, take it back to the way it was before, but do it with different materials because we no longer have access to whatever, okay? We saw this happen, for instance, with a lot of Dior fragrances, okay? So there were reformulations required on certain Dior fragrances, a lot of them dealing with oak moss, okay? And in the case of Fahrenheit, the barrel note, which was a kind of a patent thing, but the barrel note had some materials in it that were no longer allowed. So they had to reformulate those things. Well, they got a lot worse for a little while. Egoist was another one from Chanel. It got a whole lot worse because couldn't use sandalwood anymore, couldn't use rosewood, okay, couldn't use a lot of materials that were in the original version of Egoist. However, eventually, once the reputation on these fragrances declined, it was decided we need to right this ship. We need to fix it. And that happened with Dior with Egoist. You know, Jacques Paul created a very good sandalwood replacer. Not perfect, but a very good one that went into Egoist, okay? Now, in the case of Dior, a lot of the fragrances were recomposed altogether from the ground up because Francois Demachy became the house perfumer. He took all the formulas in-house by remaking them all from scratch using GCMS technology and his own nose, recreating Fahrenheit, recreating Eau Sauvage, etc., etc. And it gave him the opportunity to fix things. And one of the things he was able to fix was that petrol barrel note in Fahrenheit. So there was a stark increase in the quality of Fahrenheit after Demachy began making it himself. So that's a good reformulation. Other cases, it's what's called formula drift, where a fragrance is so old, has been reformulated so many times that, like recording over a cassette tape repeatedly, the quality wanders. We see this with fragrances like classic Guerlains. We see this with things like Fougère Royale. So what has to happen is, if it's a very antiquated fragrance, like example would be giggity, Thierry Vasseur, with the most recent version of giggity, decided not to reformulate from the recent iterations, but to go all the way back to the original formula. He went to the Osmothèque. He visited the Osmothèque, where they reconstructed the original giggity, and he referenced that fragrance for the new formula of it. So a lot of people who smell it are going to be like, hey, this smells a lot different than what I was expecting. But what they don't realize is they're not really smelling a new build of giggity. They're smelling a recreation of the original build. So it's technically more authentic to the original release than anything from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. Now, I love the older giggities from the 70s, 80s, 90s, okay? So those are great fragrances, but I'd be very open to smell the newest batch that is supposed to smell more like the original stuff. Fougère Royale had the same thing happen. When Rajadov, his real name Roger Bird, teamed up with Rodrigo Florid Roux, and they went to the Osmothèque and smelled the original Fougère Royale, and same thing. Decided to build a new version of Fougère Royale based on the original, not using the 50s and 60s versions, because those versions were very powdery, very vanillic, very heavy, very sweet, because at that time that was popular, and adjustments were made to Fougère Royale in the 50s to be more in line with what guys liked then. So that 2010 bottle that we have with the little patchwork on the front and the little like plaque on it, that's more true to the antiquated formula from the 1800s than anything prior to it. Now, of course, there are a lot of reformulations, you know, compulsory ones, not ones that are done by choice, that are just okay. They're what I call, it's not an improvement, it's actually a decrease in quality, but it's acceptable. It's an acceptable loss, right? It's an acceptable loss. And usually what you get in those situations is a fragrance that smells good, objectively speaking, smells good, smells quality, is what it's trying to be. Mission accomplished here, guys. But it's significantly different enough from older bottles that the particular qualities those old bottles possessed that the new one no longer possesses might be a deal breaker for some people. And that's okay. Not everyone's going to like it. Good example of that, in my mind, would be the current state of Paco Rabanne Pour Homme. It smells every bit like a classic aromatic fougere, soapy, clean, lovely patchouli, okay? That fragrance, however, if you side by side it with the 1973 bottles or even the early 80s bottles, that side by side will tell you that there have been significant changes to the fragrance. But those changes, changing the dry down, mostly the oak moss is not there, clearly, have pushed the fragrance in a new direction, but it's a direction that is still a good direction. Maybe not as good if people are just dead set on having that deep vintage, okay? They can go out and find it, pay the finder's fee for it, have it. But by and large, what we have on the market today as Paco Rabanne Pour Homme is still a good fragrance. It's still a respectable formulation of the fragrance. Could it be better? Absolutely. It could absolutely be better. It could 100% be better. But is it a shadow of its former self? Is it ruined? Is it some mockery? No. No, it's not. It's not a mockery. Okay? And you will find that right there, that acceptable loss, is the vast majority of these reformulations. You know, you smell the current state of Pasha de Cartier. You smell the current state of Jules by Christian Dior. You smell the current state of Antaeus. Okay, a lot of these houses, a lot of these brands that have taken time and taken care to reformulate their fragrances will walk away with a product that will be acceptable to the bulk and majority of people who enjoy that fragrance, okay? There's always going to be the fringe element that, no, I need those old bottles, and that's okay, all right? That's a minority group, and that minority group can fight for those vintage bottles on eBay and pay out the nose, you know, sell a kidney if they want to. $400, $500 for a deep vintage bottle of Jules right now, okay? That's a lot of money. That's Creed money. Okay, so if you're not that 1% of people out there, or whatever, maybe 5% of people out there that's willing to pay that kind of coin for that, you can buy the new version of Jules, and it is acceptable. It is still a great green aromatic leather fragrance. Is it as good as the old one? Hell no. Hell no. I am not going to lie to you. I am not going to lie to you and say that new Jules is as good as old Jules. But is it really good? Yes, it is. It is better than a lot of things you could be spending the same money on. The same money on it is better than a lot of things out there. And that can only be good. Okay, that can only be good. Now, there are also reformulations that are complete and utter garbage. Okay, I've been very vocal about that. I'm not the person who is going to try and, you know, be in denial about bad reformulations existing. They do exist, okay? Clearly they do. I'm not going to blow smoke up your butt, all right? And I've said, when a reformulation is just so awful, I'm like, why did they bother making this? You know? And we have those fragrances. They exist, okay? I've been very adamant about the current state of One Man Show. It's Pine Sol. It's floor cleaner. It's ridiculous. You know, usually though, when you see that, it's because the fragrance was very material specific. It required a specific material to complete the composition, and that material was removed either because of cost, or if it was an animalic material in the case of One Man Show being castoreum, maybe ethics. We can't use animal products anymore, so the castoreum had to come out, all right? Whatever the reason for it being removed, the material was never replaced. So they worked around the absence of that material in the composition. A lot of classic guirlands, okay? A lot of other things that relied heavily on sandalwood. They pull the sandalwood out. They don't really put anything in its place that can do a good enough job to replace it. Guerlain did actually do a good job, but there are a lot of houses that don't. They just go, okay, no more sandalwood. We'll throw in some Javanol, whatever. We'll throw in some of this other material. Okay, it's good enough for government work. Let's go punch out and have a beer, right? And that's it. And that's not cool. People don't like that. You see a lot of that with drugstore fragrances. But I have to reiterate, guys, drugstore fragrances were cheap from the onset. They were cheap in the 50s. They were cheap in the 60s. They've always been cheap, but they had access to better materials because materials cost less back then. Now, those same materials are prohibitively expensive. Sandalwood was so plentiful, okay? They were putting sandalwood in stuff like Royal Copenhagen. They were putting sandalwood in stuff like Love's Baby Soft. Can you imagine Love's Baby Soft? Sold it like Rite Aid and stuff, CVS, Walgreens, a little pink bottle, had real sandalwood in it. That's silly. A lot of Avon fragrances from back then. Again, real sandalwood, all right? These were cheap materials back then. Guess what? They're not cheap now. And the problem is, these fragrances, if they still exist, these drugstore fragrances, they're still being made to cost. Now the cost is probably a lot lower than it was in the 60s, the 70s, due to inflation and all that. So, yeah, you're going to smell a new bottle of English leather, and it's a travesty. You're going to smell a new bottle of British Sterling, and it's an absolute garbage can. You know, a new bottle of Mandate or a new bottle of Blue Stratos, these other classic drugstore fragrances, they are going to smell like hot crap on a tin plate. And it's what they are, okay? But they were always cheap. It's just now, key difference here, now the cheapness really shows. It didn't show back then because the quality of material for what you had to pay, the quality per pound was much higher. Now, the cheapness, which has always been there, the cheapness really shows. It's just a fact of life with drugstore fragrances. It's why they don't really make them anymore. You don't see them. Drugstores don't carry drugstore brands. They carry designers and stuff now because that whole market has basically gone extinct. It's been dead for the past 20 years, okay? The few that survive are just zombie walking. They are the undead marching into the future. A lot of these really poor reformulations that you see, you know, the really terrible reformulation of Monsieur de Givenchy, the really terrible reformulation of One Man Show, the really awful reformulations of a lot of these drugstore fragrances like English leather, they are just kind of zombie marching like this because the brands don't care. They think they can get away with it, and the sales don't lie. People buy it, and they do. They're going to keep selling them like that. It's just a fact of life, once again. So there you guys have it, man. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Now, what I want to know from you in the comment section is what brands do you think have done a good job of curating, maintaining their fragrances over the years, and what brands have done a piss poor job, utter garbage, you know? Anyone in between, that's okay. Give me the stuff in between too. I personally think that brands like Varanis did a good job of maintaining their fragrances. Estee Lauder also in general has done a good job. I think that Chanel, with a few exceptions, Chanel has also done a good job. Hermes has also done a good job. You know, overall, these are fragrances that maybe not as good for some people as the originals, but are respectable. But then there are brands that just don't care. But I want to know what your choices are. Which brands do you think have maintained the integrity, the spirit of their fragrances over the years with new versions? And which ones have just dropped the ball? All right, this has been the Unlist. Once again, sorry for the fans in the background, but thanks for watching anyway. See ya.